So this poem, I Am Very Bothered, by Simon Armitage, explores the theme of love, and it's from the perspective of a child. Simon Armitage was a plain-speaking Yorkshire man who wrote about ordinary life and everyday things. This poem is no exception. He writes an anecdote about a time he remembers as a young boy when he played a prank on a girl who he was romantically interested in, and he now feels guilty about it. Therefore, this poem adopts a highly conversational and confessionary tone, conveyed through recurring enjambement, which means that the lines run on to each other, as I'm sure you can see. That first line runs on to the second. I am very bothered when I think of the bad things I've done in my life. That's called enjambment, and it creates that conversational flow to the poem. Given that this poem also has 14 lines, it makes it a sonnet. However, it's a highly unconventional sonnet. It doesn't fit the ordinary rules of, say, an octave or a sestet. It also doesn't have a rhyme scheme, which we normally associate with a sonnet. Therefore, it's highly unconventional. And one could argue that this is because sonnets were usually written about kind of romanticised and hyperbolized love. However, this poem isn't so much about love as about honesty, conveyed through the opening first-person narration, I am very bothered, and the anecdotal confessionary tone there. And therefore, it makes sense that he would write an unconventional sonnet, because it's not just a poem about love, it's also about honesty. Now, he goes on to use a simple, uncomplicated register through phrases like bad things. When I think of the bad things I have done, that's a very simple and uncomplicated register, which conveys the childish persona and perspective that Armitage adopts in this poem. He goes on to tell us a very specific anecdote about a time in a chemistry lab when he handed heated scissors to the girl who he fancied, and he uses active verbs throughout the opening stanza, verbs such as played, called, handed. These active verbs suggest a sense of, I suppose, menace, playfulness, childishness, and immaturity. The vivid nature of the sonnet is conveyed through the colour imagery, naked lilac flame. That colour imagery suggesting that this is a vivid memory which stands out in his mind as something that elicits great shame. Therefore, in the second stanza, we have a tonal shift to a much more formal and hyperbolized tone, immediately evidenced through that hyperbole of O. That apostrophe, O, a dramatic outburst, shifts the tone and almost mimics the style of Shakespearean sonnets, which elevates his message of guilt, confession, and honesty. He goes on to use olfactory imagery associated with smell, through the unrivaled stench. And again, that evokes a sense of heightened pain and shows the extent of his guilt, that he talks about branding her skin, marking her skin permanently. And this is the point in the poem where we have the only full rhyme through skin and in, which draws our attention to the pain that he inflicted upon this girl. The only full rhyme in the poem, which draws our attention to the pain. And he explains that his action of handing over this pair of scissors has left 2 burning rings on the girl's finger, rings which will be there for eternity. And both of those words create imagery of marriage, which is a recurring motif throughout the poem. Simon Armitage was married, and therefore this poem, you could argue, was written for his wife, which is further underlined through the direct address, "Don't believe me, please." It's direct address and a conversational tone as he speaks directly to his wife. He then uses the metaphor, explaining that it was just his butter-fingered way. This is a metaphor which connotes healing. An old wives' tale tells us that butter used to be used to treat burns. And therefore he's saying that this was his attempt of showing his love and healing this woman, trying to show the extent of his adoration for her. And he ends with the explicit reference to his intentions that this would lead to marriage, if you would marry me. So a very simplistic, childish and endearing poem about young love and how young love often plays out in, I suppose, immature and sometimes unintentionally hurtful ways. And he tries to therefore explain and confess his actions.